Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Kyle Pardue, is the VP of Sales over at Kirkpatrick Price. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Well, thanks for being here. Could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career?
Yeah, I am naturally a CPA by trade. I started out in financial statement auditing and did traditional accounting roles. I came to Kirkpatrick Price 5 years ago. I started out doing pricing and proposals for the sales team. That was kind of my first experience in sales. I did that for a couple of years and then moved over and was a director of audit delivery for a couple of years. So I supervised some of our teams that did our audit projects. And then for the last, I guess, almost 8 months now, I've been the VP of sales here.
Awesome. So, yeah, not too many folks that are former auditors and directors of service delivery going into sales. How did you find that transition?
Um, It was accidentally natural. I would have never pegged myself as being in sales. It wasn't, on my career roadmap, obviously. Um, but I found it to be very similar to a lot of the work I was doing as a director of audit delivery. I was just talking to clients about problems and helping them solve them. And sales just kind of fell out of that. And so that's how I've ended up here. I tried to just be the worst sales rep on the team. I just try to find people that are better at me at selling and just help them understand our services and our clients.
I love that approach. What do you look for, I guess, when you hire sales folks, aside from being exceptional? Like, how do you define that?
Um, I have so many non-traditional views for sales. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. There's some things I'm probably learning the hard way as I go. I get really specific about what I need and don't need. I don't hire salespeople who have sold audits before because we do audits differently, and I would have to change a lot of thinking and perceptions on that. So I look for salespeople who um, have kind of been audit adjacent. So some type of cybersecurity sales, maybe it's MSSP or pen testing, something like that. You understand selling to security leaders. And then I specifically look for people who are used to outbound prospecting. I can help scope and close deals and talk about audits. I need people going and finding new clients for us. And that's probably the biggest skill that I look for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it seems like a lot of sales teams for audit firms or really anybody within GRC, they tend to want to hire, just like you said, the folks that are really good at prospecting. And then typically in like a traditional CPA firm structure, they would have the director or senior manager come in there to kind of close the deal and serve as that subject matter expert. Do you ever foresee a situation where maybe sometime in the future we start to get like a pre-sales function in GRC? Or do you think that's not necessary?
Um, Maybe I kind of go the opposite direction. I expect our salespeople to become somewhat experts themselves. Otherwise, you become this group of people that always bring the smart person to the call. And I think it's a disservice to those salespeople for them to also not be a smart person and valuable part of the relationship with their prospect. And so much of selling today is relational. We're not taking orders anymore. And so the salesperson has to be able to bring some value to the deal, or people just won't respond to them because there's lots of people. My inbox is full of people who have nothing to offer me. They just want me to get on a call about their product. It's all about them. So, one of our sales reps passed the C-Risk certification last week. So she's got some letters to her name, and that's just one way that we're showing people hey, I'm a salesperson, but I do know how to solve your problem too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before you had mentioned that you specifically target folks that are, I think target is the right word. You're specifically reaching out to and courting basically the right people for the job. But you'd mentioned that you're like, it's a strategy of yours to shy away from folks that have sold for audit firms before. Um, Traditionally, in my experience, everybody wants to hire somebody who's done the exact same job at a direct competitor. So in your situation, what is it that they would have to unlearn for,
Yeah.
working for you guys?
I guess I don't know. So maybe I'm making a mistake. Maybe I'm making this way harder than it needs to be. But I know that for our firm, the values that we stand for, the way that we think about audits, the way that we believe that you have to sell to an audit client is different than the marketplace. And so I'd rather just have kind of a clean slate who's like, I don't even know what a SOC 2 is. And let me teach them what that is than somebody who believes a SOC 2 should be X amount of dollars and it should take this amount of time. And here's the way that you go about finding those clients and those types of things.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So you kind of alluded to the broader marketplace right now in GRC and audit. I guess we could go into that a little bit. I mean, from what I've noticed over the last 10 years or so that I've been recruiting in the field, it seems like there was a couple of firms that kind of kicked off this race to the bottom where everybody was just undercutting each other on price. And now all of a sudden we're in a situation where, some firms are doing $5,000 SOC 2s. I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but how do you, I guess, sell something that's not competing on price when there's so much pressure to do so in this marketplace, I guess?
I think that's where the fun is. Our firm is not owned by private equity. We're a debt-free firm. And so I don't have, investors to be beholden to. I mentioned my start at Kirkpatrick Price was in pricing. And so I didn't know anything about sales, pricing, or cybersecurity. And I had to do a learning and self-teaching, but it made me passionate about value-based selling. I think anybody can sell the lowest price. That's easy. What I like is you were the most expensive proposal we got out of 5 firms, but we picked you because of X, Y, and Z. Like that's matching my value proposition and the price of my service. But we're also I don't want the whole market. I just did a sales call right before this, and I told the person, before you get your proposal, I just want you to know, like, I'm going to be more expensive than the firm that you were using. If you're just trying to get a cheaper price than them, then we're not a good fit and we shouldn't waste our time. If you want the things that I've talked about with you, then I'm happy to get you a proposal. So I don't worry too much about that. And I think good salespeople don't have to worry about that either. There's a part of the market that we align really well with, and there's a lot of the market that we just don't. And so we don't have to sell to everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've done a fair amount of training for myself on the biz dev side for recruiting. And one of the things that I've come across recently is the importance of kind of detaching yourself from the outcome and not feeling like you have to win every single deal. I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to be the best fit for some companies and an awful fit for others, regardless of how good you are. Or, I suppose there's a lot of factors that go into that. How do you identify, I guess, a client that you think is going to be a good fit for your firm and, vice versa?
It's tough. Honestly, the price does that for us a lot of times. I was talking to somebody who, I had a feeling that we were a good fit, and I kind of threw out about what pricing would be. And he was like, oh, that's more than all 3 quotes I've gotten so far put together. And I was like, I'm happy to talk to you about why it is. But if all you care about is that you're getting a cheap audit, then we're probably wasting our time. And he said, yeah, we're probably wasting our time. And we hung up. And the price told me exactly what we were. We weren't a good fit. And I didn't want to waste his time anymore. And I want to waste mine.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, so obviously the title of the show is Talent Gap Fireside Chat. So, we got to talk about the talent gap. Do you think that there's some sort of talent gap in security hiring? And if so, is that any different than like security sales hiring? Excuse me.
So I've hired and trained auditors, and I've hired and trained salespeople. They're very different, but we took a similar approach hiring auditors. We targeted security experts who had been directors of IT or CISOs or roles like that at previous companies, and we taught them how to be auditors. We didn't go out looking for people who had a bunch of audit experience. So similar kind of to what I said earlier about hiring the salespeople, I think there's a talent gap for hiring this like unicorn person, whether it's sales or audit, who just like checks all of your boxes. So I try to know what I am and what I'm not, and get people who are the things that I'm not, and I'll add the things that I am and try to make this really good fit.
Yeah, so you're hiring complementary skill sets, not the same person copied over and over and over again. I think so much of hiring in security and in sales, and I built a few sales teams at this point, but so much of it is just you have a list of requirements, 5 years of experience selling at an audit firm, exceeded quota at least 6 of the 10, last quarters, or whatever the requirements may be. It's always very specific.
Mm.
And I don't know, I feel like there's a big talent gap in a lot of cases between what hiring managers expect candidates are going to look like and what qualifications candidates actually have. And there's very little paying attention to more of the intangibles. Well, at least until you get into the interview process. And,
Yeah.
maybe that's a different topic altogether. But on the front end, screening people, going through resumes, things like that, it's very much check all these boxes. So, given that you have to look for something in a resume, what do you typically look for on the front end before you start talking to folks?
Yeah, I actually think you have a tough role, because so much of my recruiting has been kind of looking at different profiles, based on some criteria, but just seeing, well, they meet my criteria, but they've only ever worked at a 2,500 person company or larger. They're not going to be a good fit in my 110 person company. They won't know how to work here. So I think it's really hard to just take a list of requirements and go to people and know if they're going to work or not. So when I've recruited, I'll message people on LinkedIn, and sometimes they'll message you back and say, yeah, I'm interested in hearing more. And so I do a 15-minute phone call. I'm not trying to interview them, and just seeing if there's interest. And just about every single time at the end of that 15-minute phone call, and I'm mostly talking about Kirkpatrick Price on that call to see if they're interested, but I know whether I'm going to hire them or not. Now that's not to say I'm laser focused and can't be talked out of it, but there's just like there's a feel to it that as a recruiter, it would be tough to replicate that. So I don't know. There's not like a magic box to check to say, yeah, this person will work. A lot of it's just, I would die for them.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. I mean, it seems like a lot of what I do as a recruiter is I'm making a lot of judgment calls. I don't think people realize that. They think, oh, I'm just matching keywords, but everything's contextual, kind of as you'd mentioned. So they may check every box, technically, whatever's on the job description or whatever requirements you have in your head, but they may not. There's some other piece of information that would disqualify that person, and it's not always something that's on the page. And you have to have the intelligence, the analytical ability to think through that and think why that person may or may not be a fit. That's why I don't necessarily believe that AI is ever going to be as good of a sourcer as a human that's really niche and dedicated in their field. Maybe it's possible, but I haven't seen one yet. And then once you get to the conversation, that's something that's even far in a way tougher, because that's art, not science. That's as you mentioned, it's a feel. Like, have you ever thought about, this is somebody that you would buy from, but what are the characteristics that make up somebody that you would buy from?
Yeah.
Like, are there certain through lines that you could recognize of maybe people that you've hired in the past?
Yeah, you're right. It's too nuanced and too interpersonal to expect AI to navigate this, because buyers, sometimes we're kind of dumb as buyers. It's just like, how did that person make me feel on the call? So I hired a rep just a few weeks ago. I guess it was beginning of February now. the first call I talked to him, I just felt calm, felt comfortable, I felt relaxed. Um, and I was like, I'm probably going to hire this guy. And then a little bit later on, he told me a story in his interview that like confirmed all the feelings that I already had. Um, which is why I hired him. It like gave me the confirmation. But there's just something about the way a person makes you feel. If you leave a call feeling heard, understood, cared for, those types of feelings incite buying. Even if I said the same information as the other firm that you're talking to, the person in the seat that you're buying from matters.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I feel like the picture that people have in their head of a salesperson is like the exact opposite of that. It's not the patient listener that makes you feel calm. It's the person that pressures you into doing something, that, the used car salesman trope.
So last month, we took the plunge. We bought a minivan. Now I hate car buying. I'm like their worst nightmare. I'm a salesperson who's got a pricing and behavior economics background. First place we went to, we walked away because it was probably the right van for us, but the person and just the culture was so crappy. I like caught them in a couple lies, and I told the guy, I was like, this is not true. And so we went to this other place, and we sat with the guy, and he just kind of shot the crap with us. We talked about our experiences. We were waiting on the van to get cleaned and brought around. And by the time we were done, like, my wife looked at me and she said, I'd rather buy a van for him than that other place. And so the person selling the van matters in the transaction. It's not just this product versus that product.
So yeah, totally agree. And it's interesting you mentioned transactions. So I think good salespeople sometimes make you forget that there's a transaction on the line. Whereas I think it's one thing I struggle with is to not have the transaction in mind, to just talk to people, because ultimately I have a goal and I'm very goal driven. How do you, like, is that something that you can teach to work towards a goal, but without worrying too much about the transactional aspect of the sale?
That's when I was the director of audit delivery, and I didn't have a quota. It wasn't even a sales title, but I got on some sales calls, and then I got on just calls that came up with our clients. And a lot of times we would end the call with a sale. It was like, hey, what's the problem? What are we trying to accomplish? And we like walk through all that information, and we would get to the end, and they would go, okay, so what do we do next? And it was like, oh, I got to send you something to sign for some money, I guess. But it just like fell out at the end. The goal wasn't to sell, it was to understand and solve a problem. And so that's what we try to teach our salespeople, is, I almost never talk about like when Kirkpatrick Price was founded on a call, or, like the typical script that you see from a salesperson. And I really don't have to. Like, there was a deal we got a couple months ago where we got the deal, and I don't think I ever told them like about our auditor experience, our platform that we use for our audit, like none of our values. We just helped them solve the problem. It's like, yeah, I'm going to work with these guys because I trust them, because they listened.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned trust. I mean, trust is important, I think, as well in the hiring process. How do you kind of mentioned that you got like a sense of comfort from somebody that you had interviewed. How do you do that on the hiring manager side to engender that sense of trust and comfort in the folks that you're interviewing? Is that purposeful, or do you think that's like a natural outgrowth of just your interview style?
I mean, you'd have to, it'd be interesting for us to, I've hired a lot of reps recently. It'd be interesting to get their perspectives on interacting with me in the hiring process, like from the other side. I just keep it real. I've hired people and they've asked like, why are you hiring? And I've said, because I had to let this person go. they'll ask about, quota and on targets and my experience. And I'm just really honest with that. It's like, if you're wanting to sign up for this ride, then I'm happy to take you. If I scare you to death and you don't want to work here, then let's figure that out right now too. 'Cause I'm not going to dress myself or our company up as something that we're not. We just need to be real about it in the recruiting process. And I think that builds trust. Um, just being super honest translates to sales.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in that case, the sale being, the match between the company and the candidate. A lot of people don't realize that recruiting is a sales role. It's actually kind of, it's like a two-pronged sales role in either direction.
Yeah.
You're somewhat selling the candidate to the company and then the company to the candidate. I prefer to view it more like matching versus, like the typical salesperson. Like I have no interest in quote unquote selling somebody a job that they don't really want in the long run, because that's a recipe for disaster. They're going to leave after 6 months, and technically that's after my guarantee ends. But at the same time, the client's feeling like they got screwed because, they weren't, technically the agreement was fulfilled, but that's not what they want, is for people to only stick around for 6 months. So yeah, I think coming at it with like a problem solving mindset and really understanding and listening to somebody effective on both, sales and recruiting fronts. What about have you ever thought about the aspect of listening in sales and in the hiring process, what role that plays?
It's probably the most important role. If I can't listen well enough to understand your problem, then I am doing the traditional car salesman sale, and I don't have credibility. I'm showing you features that you don't care about. And that turns me off super quick. I will walk away from a transaction just over that alone. And so I feel pretty passionate about it. Listening and recruiting, you mentioned this as recruiting is a map more than a sale. And I agree. And I have to understand what the person's priority is before I know if we're a match or not. And unfortunately, I have to learn that now or later. I can learn it on my first 15-minute call when I'm recruiting them and we can just agree to not work together, or I can learn it after I've spent 6 months hiring and training them. And that one's much more painful. So I'm very interested in finding the right match because I have to live with the consequences of not finding that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think radical transparency in response to what you're listening to is like a good order of operations almost, where you'll hear something kind of revealing about the person and their motivators. And you want to be able, like, if they're concerned about work-life balance and that your auditors work a lot of hours, not saying you guys do, but that's something you want to be very transparent about, and not glaze over it. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to that, they got into new roles and it was like a 180 from what they were promised about the role. And then now they're on the market again, in a down market, which is a very bad place to be for those folks. So I always encourage people to ask very deep probing questions from both the hiring side as well as the candidate side. Did you have,
And you mentioned that. I think that's especially true in sales. It's a different challenge. The sales job and comp is much more gray to me than hiring an auditor. Like when we hired an auditor, there's a very specific comp plan. There's a very specific outcome and defined success metrics. With sales, it's like, well, I want to make this much money. So then you've got to factor in like, what's the commission rate? What's the salary? How attainable is the target that I'm being given in this offer letter? Like, are other people able to do that? Or is it this made up pie in the sky number? So I do think good salespeople who are being recruited need to ask some really good questions. Almost every salesperson that I have recruited and hired actually messaged behind my back, which I appreciated, other salespeople on our team. Like they found other salespeople on our team and had conversations with those people before they took the job. And I think that's a sign of a good salesperson, but B, a good way to get a good idea of whether the offer you're receiving is crap or not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, doing that research on the front end, I feel like so much of sales and well, certainly for recruiting for me, is research on the front end. Thinking more deeply about why somebody might want to make a move, why they might be a match for your firm, researching competitors, all these things that when executed properly on the front end make the rest of the process so much easier. But I think a lot of recruiting, or the way a lot of people view recruiting is it's very transactional, it's very plug and play, it's very process driven. I'm a more analytical person personally, so I don't do very well in traditional recruiting environments where it's all about the KPIs and just smile and dial as many dials as you can get out in a day. Like I understand that volume's important to some degree, but so is quality
Yeah.
and research on the front end.
Yeah. I only have 6 people on my team. You know, if you're recruiting for a 20,000 person company, it probably is more just fill out these boxes. But for me, it's like, I got to work with you every day. You got to work with the other 5 people that are on this team. It's really important that we get it right or it derails everything. So I do think it's so critical to be pursuing quality in recruiting.
For sure. What about the aspect of quotas? Obviously, that comes up a lot in hiring salespeople. Is that something that you put a lot of stock into? Um, or is it something that you think can be so variable depending on the environment and a bunch of other different factors that you don't put much stock in it?
I mean, that's what I hate for salespeople when they're trying to get, I've heard horror stories of territories changing and quotas changing and, all these different things. I think that's, if somebody says you need to sell $2 million to meet quota, I don't know your business. Like I have no idea if that's doable or cake or not. So there is some trust that goes into that, which is why I think the verification, that we talked about earlier is important. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about quotas. Is there a different way to ask that question?
Well, I guess I'm thinking like, okay, say somebody was at 80% to quota for the last 5 years, but you really like them as a person, really clicks, think they're a good listener and that sort of thing. Would you ever hire somebody that's been below quota consistently if they had the right, intangible skills?
Absolutely. I actually don't give a crap about that stuff on the resume. Maybe that's me being non-traditional, but that street goes both ways. So you're trying to work for me and I'm giving you a quota number. You have no idea if that's attainable or not. I'm looking at your resume and you said you hit 130% of quota. A, I don't know if that's true or not. It could just be totally false. But B, you're selling a different product or service than what I'm hiring you for. It's a different company, different environment, different competitive landscape. So you saying, attained X% over quota is pretty meaningless to me. People don't put on their resume that they only hit 30% of quota. That doesn't make it on there. So it's like, well, I don't care about the 130%.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I feel like a lot of sales hiring comes down to that, though. It's those metrics that you're able to prove,
Yeah.
or at least speak to and feel very confident about. And yeah, it's interesting. I'm a big believer in hiring for potential, and it seems to
Yes.
me like you're hiring more for potential there versus what they've done in the past. Um, what are some I guess what are some traits that you would look for that would lead to like someone being a high potential individual? Like, could you qualify that at all?
Yeah, I agree. I'm more in favor of stretch hires than pretty resumes. I've seen all different types. The stretch hires are much more exciting for me. Um, I ask a question of every salesperson that I'm interviewing. I asked them what their favorite deal was that they worked on. And that, if I didn't ask any other questions, that right there would probably tell me what I need to know. Um, because they're, so the guy, I said, I asked him a question. I hired him and I knew pretty early, but he confirmed it later. I asked him what his favorite deal was. He said, well, I was trying to get into an account. We weren't in that territory at all. And I was just trying to start from the ground up. So I just picked the biggest, it was a hospital. He's there. Just picked the biggest hospital chain and went after them. And there was one guy there that I needed to get to know to be able to sell to this company. And I saw that he was like the director of some group. And so I joined the group and I got to know him in the group and I sold him the largest contract that we had sold to a company like that. And so, that now he, I guess, could have just been totally lying, there's always that, but he demonstrated creativity, initiative, beliefs, I can't teach those things. I can teach you what a SOC 2 is and what an ISO is, but you got to bring those three things with you when you come to work for me. And that one story confirmed all these sort of squishy, intangible traits that I needed from a salesperson.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it almost kind of reminds me, I talk about this idea too much probably, but kind of reminds me of the idea of investigative mindset and DFIR. When folks are hiring forensic investigators, one of the things they look for, quote unquote, is investigative mindset. And that's the ability to, think creatively. If you run into a brick wall in one area, move laterally to find, another place that you can find what you need. Kind of similar, I guess, in some ways to how like a pen tester would think, always looking for side doors, not just following a rote set of procedures and saying, okay, well, I did my job. Going beyond the initial, but obviously that takes a lot of time. Like how much do you weight, I guess, volume and activity versus creative approaches like that may not be as high on activity, but potentially pay off in a big way?
Oh man, so this is where I totally break from traditional sales leadership. LinkedIn makes me feel really dumb. I follow sales leaders on LinkedIn and I see all the stuff that they're doing and I'm like, oh, I don't do that. But it goes back to what I said earlier. I don't want to sell to the whole market. I don't want to be an audit firm for everybody. And so our salespeople don't do this traditional volume play of I got to send 200 emails a day and dial 50 numbers and all that stuff because it didn't work. We tried it. It doesn't work anymore. Maybe it does. Maybe we're just bad at dialing numbers. I'm not sure. But we do exactly what I said in that story. We find people where they're at and we build a relationship with them. Most salespeople are not willing to do the research that this guy did to find what the person he's trying to sell to cares about and go be part of that. You have to go to the meetings and be part of the group, participate in the group to build a trust and relationship with the person that you're trying to sell to. And so I think this just cold, let me hit this person at the right time with the best written email ever. I just don't think that works. It's not what I want to buy. I want to buy from the person that I know and trust. And I do that through relationship building. So, I don't know, maybe we're doing it totally wrong, but it seems to be working okay for us.
Well, I mean, it echoes the approach that I take to recruiting and the process that I've encouraged people, well, the tactics, I guess, that I've encouraged people to use when they're job seeking. In this market, we have each job posting is getting hundreds or thousands of applicants. Each internal recruiter has 20, 30 open jobs at once, like I always say. So that's so much volume. That's so much noise that anybody who's a job seeker right now and they can't find something, chances are they've been only just like mass applying to positions online, and they may get a 1% response rate. Whereas, the person that isn't blasting as many applications, but is meeting people at conferences or ISACA groups or, whatever in-person networking they're doing, or video calls, even meeting people face to face, making those emotional connections, to your point earlier, making people feel understood and heard and comfortable. And seems like in the age of automation and AI and volume and noise, these relationships matter more and more. And I've certainly noticed it as a recruiter. Like, I've tried automation and mass outbound and that sort of thing, but it just seems like the ROI is so low compared to, the relationships that I've had over the years.
Yeah, we posted. I've not hired somebody through a job posting because, to your point, I get a bunch of crap when we post. It's just a bunch of resumes that didn't even meet the criteria that was in the posting. But I'll tell you what never happened. I never had one person look at that posting and say, "I'm a good fit and I'd like to work for that company," and go find Kyle Pardue on LinkedIn and send him a message and say, "Hey, I think I'm a good fit and I want to work for your company." Because I'd probably hire that person because that's the type of mindset and activity that would make you a good seller. But nobody is willing to do that work. They just want to sit back and fire the pre-filled Indeed applications at as many job postings as they can. And that's the same reason they can't get sales and hit quotas.
Well, I think a lot of seekers, maybe not so much salespeople, where they are just used to following a rote process and just cranking out as much volume as possible. But a lot of job seekers I talk to, I encourage them to do exactly that. Like, look, you can usually find the hiring manager. You just click on the company page, click on the hyperlink for employees. That'll list every single employee working there. Type in what the job title might be for the hiring manager and find that person, send them a connection request, obviously personalize it. And your chances are really good that if they like you, they can pull you through the rest of the process. But a lot of people will push back on that. They'll say, "Oh, does that work?" Or I really feel like I would be, too aggressive, or not necessarily like a breach of privacy, but like, how would that come across? I feel like I'm overstepping my bounds by doing so. So, do you think that would work with like CISOs as well?
Um, I I think so. I mean, we get appointments with CISOs by messaging them and saying, I understand what you care about, and so we'll host events and we'll just DM people and invite them, and they open those messages and they respond and they come. So I think they would be just as willing to open a message and see somebody that cares enough about their company to take the initiative to do research to send them a message. That like builds trust and demonstrates commitment, which is something that's otherwise hard to do.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Especially if somebody doesn't know you already. But obviously referrals are kind of like the golden method
Sure.
if you can get an in somewhere, either as a job seeker or as a salesperson. Um, I guess any best practices for getting referrals into places, maybe as a salesperson or as a job seeker?
Just ask people to your point earlier. Oh, is that too pushy or aggressive? Um, if a vendor that I was working with was doing really good work for me, and they said, "Could you refer me to so and so?" It's like, well, of course I would, because I think they could do good work for them too. It's like, of course I would. But most people don't want to ask for the referral because it's like, oh, wouldn't that be? What if that's rude, or what if it's awkward? No, it's rude or awkward if you do crappy work. It's pretty good work. Of course, I want to refer you to somebody. I want to help my friends.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and I think people underestimate the amount of times that somebody that they have a good relationship wants to help them out.
Yes.
Yeah, like you said, there's a sense of putting somebody out when in reality they'd be happy to. And if you do a good job for somebody else, it makes them look good too. It's a scratch my back situation for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, absolutely. Anything else, I guess, else that you look for in new hires that we haven't covered?
No, it's the intangible stuff. I don't do a mock um sales presentation. I've heard that lots of people do that. I think you're selling yourself to me. So I watched you do a sales presentation on the thing that you know best, which is yourself. And so if you haven't done that well, probably not going to do very well on a product you don't know, doing a fake presentation. Um, but I look for people who have sold at a smaller company that's significant. We don't have the brand, we don't have the resources and tools and mature processes that a company 5 times our size would have. And so if that's all you've ever done, you won't be successful here. I try to find people who have had a harder sell. So maybe selling a want instead of a need type of service or product. Maybe a more competitive market, something like that. But if this is the hardest sales job you've ever done, that's probably not going to be great either. And so those are some things that I look for that are hard to quantify on like a recruiting checklist. But those are important in my stretch hires.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and you mentioned want versus need. I think that's an important distinction. So, I mean, compliance is a need, but expensive compliance isn't a need, it's a want. So, yeah, it almost seems like though in a down market or down economy is, well, that's my opinion anyway, that's currently the situation that we're in. There's an increasing push to basically enforcement is what gets things done, the stick, not the carrot. So how do you sell in an environment like that where, people are looking to check the box more than maybe they would be in a market where they had a little bit more cash? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, nobody's ever just like hoarding cash that they don't know what to do with, obviously. But have you had to adapt, I guess, to this economic environment at all?
We lost the deal a couple weeks ago with somebody that I really wanted us to work with. I think they really wanted to work with us. They just physically did not have the money to do. And I understand that happens. There's a group that you can maybe try to convince that there's money worth spending. The $5,000 audit isn't worth the $5,000. You need to go spend, some multiple more than that. That's hard to do. I mean, you can be the best salesperson in the world, and 5,000 versus 40,000 is just tough to. I mean, I get it. But there's a part of the market where you can, if you're looking in the right places, you find the people who have the resources, who see the value. So for me, it's not as much about convincing the person that doesn't have the money to go find more money. It's about finding the people who you're a good fit with, who already have the money to spend on something like this. So I don't know, maybe that's a cheap cop out, but I found it incredibly hard to convince the $5,000 people to do something else, even no matter what you say.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a fair point. I mean, it reminds me of the idea of the Pareto principle. Are you familiar?
Mm.
The 80-20 rule. Yeah. So basically 80% of your results will come from 20% of your customers, or 80% of your revenue from 20% of your customers. So to focus on the ones that you're the best possible fit for, it's more efficient that way. You're not spending a bunch of cycles trying to convince people that they're not there, so spending the time more so on trying to find the customers that are the more ideal fit for you, again, goes back to research and analysis and legwork on the front end. So yeah, that's a great point. Well, we're actually coming up on time here, Kyle. So just one last question for you. Is there anything we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
There are a lot of salespeople that don't want to do the work. Either they've never learned how to do it, or they just don't want to do it anymore. Sales has gotten a lot harder to me in the 5 years that I've been here. The game is totally different. People weren't really remote until right when I started. That's like changed so much. But most people don't want to do the creative, the story I shared earlier. Like most of those people don't want to do that anymore. And I don't know, I guess they're making money somewhere, not putting in that work, or maybe they're just bouncing from place to place. but there are enough people who are willing to go join a group or do some really intense targeted research. Everybody wants to just kind of automate and stay in their desk. We gotta get out and meet people and be in person. So I would say that to the name of the podcast, that's the talent gap right now, is just a lack of interest in doing hard work.
Well, yeah, and you got to figure over the coming years as the agentic AI gets better, and we didn't really go too much into this. Like, the way I see it is a lot of the more commoditized types of, sales professions could be taken over by even better websites with chatbots that are better at asking questions than a human is, So we'll see how that plays out in the coming years. Well, that's a great point, great place to end, Kyle. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do so?
LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn every hour, so shoot me a message. Be happy to respond.
Sounds good. Yeah, and we'll include your link there in the description as well. Well, thanks for your time, Kyle.
Yep. It's good to connect with you.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.